Hello, beautiful souls. I'm Dr. Carrie Meridian, and welcome back to the Meridian Astrology Forecast. Each week, we spend a little time together looking at what's happening in the sky. Not because astrology determines our future, but because I believe astrology can help us understand ourselves more deeply, make more conscious choices, and ultimately return to ourselves. And this week, we arrive at another turning point. We've moved through the Lion's Gate. We've moved through the Leo solar eclipse. We've spent the last week integrating what all of that may have revealed. And now, the energy changes. Virgo season begins. Mercury comes home to Virgo, and by the end of the week, we reach a powerful full moon lunar eclipse in Pisces. So if the last several weeks have been asking, who am I becoming? This week asked, what am I finally ready to stop carrying? So let's talk about it. The sun moves into Virgo as we begin the week, and immediately the energy feels different. Leo asked us to shine, to create, to express ourselves, to stop hiding. Virgo looks at everything Leo discovered and says, okay. Now, what are we actually going to do with it? Because Virgo is practical, intentional, discerning. It notices details. It looks at our routines and our habits, our health, our work, our responsibilities, and the small choices that eventually become our lives. And I think that's exactly the energy we need after everything we've just experienced. Because transformation isn't only about having a breakthrough. Eventually, the breakthrough has to become a behavior. So what does that mean for us? This week isn't necessarily asking you to completely reinvent your life. It's asking you to notice the little things, like what habit no longer supports you, what routine needs to change, what responsibility isn't actually yours, where are you spending energy simply because you've always spent energy there, and maybe most importantly, what would your everyday life look like if it actually reflected the person you're becoming? Returning to yourself isn't only about knowing who you are. It's about building a life where that person can actually exist. And Virgo reminds us, sometimes the biggest transformations began with very small choices. And then on Tuesday, the planet that rules Virgo joins the sun there, which means the mental fog begins giving way to something we desperately needed: clarity. And Mercury enters Virgo on Tuesday. Mercury loves them some Virgo. Our thinking can become clearer, more organized, more analytical. We may become better able to separate what we feel from what we actually know. And after eclipse season, that's incredibly valuable because intense emotions can sometimes make everything feel urgent. Virgo says, look again. What are the facts? What do you actually know? What are you assuming? What needs more information? So what does that mean for us? Maybe you don't need another sign. Maybe you just need clarity. Maybe you don't need another opinion. Maybe you just need to trust what you've already observed. Maybe you don't need to make the decision today. Maybe you simply need to gather enough information so that when you do decide, you're choosing from discernment rather than fear. So returning to yourself, ask yourself, what do I know to be true when I remove fear from the conversation? That's a very different question from what am I afraid might happen? And sometimes returning to yourself means learning to tell the difference. But the universe isn't finished with this conversation because Thursday brings Mercury directly into the heart of the sun. And suddenly, something may become very, very clear. Because on Thursday, the sun and Mercury meet in Virgo. This can illuminate something like a realization, a conversation, a decision, a piece of information. Something that has felt confusing may all of a sudden make perfect sense. And because this happens in Virgo, the answer may not arrive dramatically. It might simply be practical. Sometimes enlightenment sounds less like I've discovered the meaning of life and more like, oh, I know what I need to do now. So what does that mean for us? Pay attention to what becomes obvious, especially something you've been overcomplicating. Virgo has a wonderful ability to cut through noise and ask, what actually works? Not what looks impressive, not what everybody else thinks you should do, and not what you've always done. What works now? Maybe clarity isn't about knowing the next 10 steps. Maybe it's simply knowing the next one. And that's enough. Because the very next day, the energy moves from clarity into release. And now we arrive at the heart of this week, the full moon lunar eclipse in Pisces. We began this eclipse season with the solar eclipse in Leo, asking us to step into something new. And now the lunar eclipse asks us to release. Pisces is intuitive, emotional, spiritual, compassionate, dreamy, and deeply connected to surrender. Across the sky, the sun is in Virgo. And I think the Virgo-Pisces axis gives us one of the most beautiful questions of this entire eclipse season. What can I change? And what must I finally surrender? Virgo wants to fix. Pisces understands that not everything can be fixed. Virgo organizes, Pisces releases. Virgo asked us to discern, Pisces asks us to trust. And somewhere between the two, we find wisdom. So what does that mean for us? Something may be reaching completion. Maybe it's external, but maybe it's internal. An expectation, a disappointment, an old dream, a relationship with the past, a version of yourself you've been trying to resurrect, a question that may never receive the answer you wanted. Got plenty of those. And perhaps you don't need another answer. Perhaps you need permission to stop asking the question. That is release. Not pretending something didn't matter, not pretending it didn't hurt, not erasing the past, simply deciding, I don't need to carry this anymore. And this connects beautifully with the larger energy we've been moving through. Because returning to yourself isn't only about discovering what belongs to you. It's also about recognizing what doesn't. The guilt that isn't yours. The expectations that aren't yours. The responsibility that isn't yours. The story that isn't true anymore. The identity that helped you survive one chapter but doesn't belong in the next. So here's the question I want you to sit with during this eclipse. What am I ready to bless, thank, and release? Not because it never mattered, but because perhaps it has already taught you what you came here to learn. But apparently, the universe decided one eclipse wasn't enough excitement for Friday, because Mercury and the Sun also challenge Uranus. Uranus represents disruption, awakening, surprise, change, and freedom. So plans may change. Information may arrive unexpectedly. Something may not go exactly the way you thought it would. And our first instinct might be, wait, that's not the plan. So what does that mean for us? Stay flexible, especially around eclipse energy, because sometimes what looks like disruption is actually redirection. That doesn't mean every inconvenience is a cosmic sign. Sometimes plans simply just change. But when something unexpected happens, instead of immediately trying to force everything back into place, pause. Ask, is there another possibility here that I couldn't see before? Sometimes returning to yourself requires changing direction, because you are allowed to revise the plan. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to discover that something you once wanted isn't what you want anymore. And y'all, that isn't failure. That's awareness. And when I look at this astrology, beside larger energetic themes we began moving through, the message becomes even clearer. We've been moving through a cycle of wisdom, clarity, discernment, and ultimately release. And now the astrology mirrors that beautifully. Virgo brings clarity. Mercury brings discernment. The eclipse brings culmination. Pisces brings surrender. So perhaps this isn't a week for asking, what else can I add? Maybe the better question is, what can I finally put down? Because sometimes we think growth means accumulating more knowledge, more responsibilities, more projects, more relationships, more goals. But sometimes growth looks like subtraction, less noise, less proving, less explaining, less caring, less abandoning yourself to maintain something you've already outgrown. And maybe that's what creates space for what's next, right? So, when I step back and look at this entire week, I see a movement from clarity into release. Virgo says, look carefully. Mercury says, tell yourself the truth. Then Sun says, see clearly. Pisces says, surrender what you cannot control. And Uranus says, be willing to change direction if you need to. And together, they give us one simple message. You don't have to carry everything you've survived into the life you're creating. Some things were lessons. Some things were seasons. Some things were people. Some things were dreams. And some things were versions of you that got you here. Honor them. Thank them. And when you're ready, let them go. Just let them go. So here's your reflection question for this week. What am I carrying simply because I've carried it for a long time? And then ask yourself, who might I become if I finally put it down? Sit with that. Journal about it. Let the answer come. Because returning to yourself isn't always about finding something you've lost. Sometimes it's realizing that underneath everything you've been carrying, you were there all along. Thank you so much for spending part of your week with me on the Meridian Astrology Forecast. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What are you ready to leave behind in this chapter? Until next time, remember, the stars may illuminate the path, but you're the one who chooses to walk it. Keep looking to the stars and keep returning to yourself.